This is such a difficult story to know how to start to tell, because in reality it goes from 1779 up to 1934. But you could tell it from the point of view of when did I discover, when did I first learn about the bookbinding strike? Or you could go back to 1846 when the world first rediscovered the bookbinding strike. Or you could go back to 1786, the year of the strike. Or you could go back to 1888 when it was discovered again in the pages of the Bookbinders Trade Journal in England. So there's lots of different ways of telling this story. But before I get right into it, I have an advert. Everybody is in agreement that the greatest book, the greatest printed book of the 19th century was the Kelmscott Chaucer. And you all know that, right? If you don't know everything about it, if you're potted history, produced in 1897. William Morris came late to books, which is very odd because he's known for many of his famous phrases. I won't repeat them all, you know them all already, but there's one you might not know. He said, the best thing you can do is to build a house. The second best thing you can do is to build a book. And he said that because in the last 10 years of his life, starting in 1890, he was persuaded by a few of his friends, Edward Burne-Jones, Rossetti, Sidney Cockrell, who was his secretary, and various others, that he really needs now to turn his attention to fine printing. And he did. And he gathered around him some of the best printers and illustrators and bookbinders that were working then. And the press lasted for about 9 years, a couple of years after his death in 1897, and then turned into the Doves Press, etc., etc. So we're at the height of the arts and crafts movement. And here is a nice spread from the Kelmscott Chaucer. So 5 years ago, right here in San Francisco, I was presented with a copy of the Kelmscott Chaucer with a view to making a nice contemporary binding for it. And I was very daunted by this because they only produced 380 copies, of which we know where 330 are because that couple whose name I forget did the survey, which is a book you can now buy. And they've tracked down 330 of them. Of those, the majority are still in their original bindings and should remain in their original bindings, obviously. Some are in beautiful contemporary or later, more modern fine bindings and should stay in that state. So before I saw the book, I said to the client, I'm a bit wary because the likelihood is I'm not going to want to put this into a new binding because of those reasons I just stated. He said, wait till you see the book. Anyway, the point is, William Morris did the ornamentation, about 14 different patterns. He also designed the typeface, bringing back black letter from William Caxton to William Morris, because that was their project. He also designed all these lovely initial letters, so he was himself an amateur typographer. Don't forget, William Morris was an amateur in the true sense. He had no training. Everything he did was through his passion. Edward Burne-Jones did the 138 illustrations, and Emery Walker, who was an exceptional printer, cut the punches, made the molds, cast the type, set the type, and printed the book on paper that Morris himself had designed with his paper makers. It was an extraordinary project. It made no money. None of Morris's things really made money. And the binder, of course, on the luxury editions was Cobden Sanderson, himself, like Morris, a wealthy socialist, our favourite kind of socialist. And they put all their energies and monies into making the world better. And Cobden Sanderson, of course, taught Douglas Cockrell, whose son Sidney Cockrell taught Gillian, whose other employees and apprentices taught the people who taught me. So we're all descended from William Morris, or rather from Cobden Sanderson. Cobden Sanderson, who was originally called, his name is Tom, his original name was Tom Sanderson, and he married Annie Cobden and took her name. He was a feminist, so was she. She was a suffragette, she went to prison 4 times. And he, Cobden Sanderson, coined the phrase the arts and crafts movement. Not William Morris, not Burne-Jones, not Rossetti. It the bookbinder. Tonight is about how important bookbinders are in the world, and that's one example. So, he brought the book here, in the old building, and there it is. It's horrendous. Poorly bound on leather that's now rotten, no design of any shape or form. So I was relieved, yes, we can go ahead. The trouble is, the reason it took me 5 years is because of two things he said. The first thing he said was in the letter, what they call the commissioning letter, I would like the book, when finished, to be something that William Morris would be pleased with and Bernard Middleton would be proud of. And Bernard Middleton, the greatest living bookbinder, was my mentor when I was at college. I chose him because he was famous. And he's been a friend ever since. So that was daunting, but also he said, I'd like the design to be both traditional and contemporary. And that threw me. And I don't do sketches or drawings, I don't know how to. So I read the book, look at it, and then let it mull, let it just percolate. And about 3.5 years ago, I got the design. And how I got the design was I realised that William Morris is an artist. I can't possibly respond to these, they're too complicated, but I was drawn to the ornaments, so I chose 10, and I turned them into line drawings that I had turned into dies that I was able to stamp into leather. Secondly, I realised I wanted the book to be a tribute to William Morris, so I hooked upon the idea of the letter W and the letter M, which make nice mirror images of each other, and the book itself gives an opportunity to do a mirror image. And then I realised, oh, Morris is a man who designs new letter forms, so why don't I, as an amateur typographer, design a new typeface for this book for the new age. So this is called a Kelmscott Chaucer for our age. And the other thing, of course, is the whole thing is rubricated with these small, thin lines of red. So the book is black with a thin red line going through it. And then I had my design. And there it is. So there's the W and the M, there's the traditional, there's the modern, and there's the thin red line going around everything. And there's the end paper that gets thrown out with the thin red line. And there's the box, which is lined with double pads, one red, one black, and the black one, of course, obscures everything except the edge. And the headband the same, and the thin red line of the end paper. And he didn't want it trimming, which is good. He wanted it left as it was. And that's a view down the omnes. And these are all, to make life easy, these are stamped off the book. And I was having trouble with my stamper in England because it's not robust enough. So I had to call a halt to the project and bring all that leather with me here. And I did the stamping at John Demerit's bindery in Emeryville because he's got a big pencil, I could do that. And then you cut out a hole from the cover leather, paint the edges of everything red, and then drop your shapes in. Makes life easy. So on Monday, July the 10th, something like that, that Monday in July, I'm doing a talk about the making of this book at the book club, to which you're all invited because it's free, you don't have to be a member, and they've got nice wine and good things.
Make a reservation.
But do make a reservation because they'd like to know how many bottles to open. But you are all welcome. How many people haven't been to the book club? This is your opportunity to come. It's a fantastic place. So it looks like most of you, but how many people are members of the book club? Oh, well, you'll all see it. That's great. And they, of course, have a copy of the Chaucer, so that will be on display, which is fabulous. Now, oh yes, the binding has been donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is really great. It was going to go to the British Library, but we, between us, changed tack and realised it had to go to the V&A because William Morris was part of the founding of the National Art Library. And in fact, we sealed the deal, so to speak, in the Green Cafe, which William Morris did all the decoration on. So it was terribly thoughtful. And I started the binding without realising that on William Morris's birthday. So the whole thing was just terribly, kismet like that. So Monday, July the 10th, I think it is, at the book club, and I'm going to do a whole thing from the process from beginning to end. It's kind of interesting. So actually I'm going to start the story in Dublin. And I mentioned this last year, Michael and I did, but very much peripherally, talking about our travels. We went to Dublin last year, and we went to the National Print Museum. Now, okay, just step back a minute. I knew about the strike because when I was at college in the late 80s, a very difficult time politically in London, the poll tax riots were going on. We were trying to get rid of Margaret Thatcher. We succeeded eventually, but there were union-crushing days, and all my teachers are union men. They were all men. They'd all come through the apprenticeship. They were all members of SOGAT, the same union as the printers, Society of Graphic something and Allied Trades. And my teacher, John Vivian, who was a communist, would tell us about the strike and try to educate us, and we didn't really listen. I mean, I think I listened more than the other students, but I remembered it. I remembered that there were these people called the victims, and I remembered that every June there was a dinner, right up until the 1940s, so he'd been to one when he was a lad, to celebrate these martyrs. They're called victims or martyrs, the men that went to prison to demand better working conditions in the bindery. And I also knew, and it was known throughout the trade, that there was a banner, a famous banner, and it was in Dublin, and nobody had seen it for years. So we went last year to the National Print Museum. Has anybody been there? You need to go immediately. It's got the only functioning pen ruling machine that I've ever seen, and the American Bookbinders Museum has one. They're trying to get it working, so we spoke to the 4 guys there and told them about this place, and they all said, well, they need to get it working. Oh yeah, well, I'm free. How do you fix, lads? A free trip to San Francisco. Okay, come. And actually, it's got to the point now where, to be serious, I think they are going to have to get one of those guys in Dublin to come and get it working, because nobody here seems to know how to do it. Anyway, we walk in there, and there's the banner hanging right in the middle of the room, the famous banner. Now, so on here, you've got some of Ireland's famous authors, Jonathan Swift, Edmund Burke, Thomas More, Oliver Goldsmith, etc. You know, all the writers that came out of Ireland that English people think are English, but they're actually all Irish. And there's a monk doing something Irish with letters in the middle. And on the other side is that. So this is a trade union banner that's carried on May Day. You know, it's the banner they march with through the streets of Dublin. This is the Irish branch. Of course, in these days, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, so they were part of the whole country. So there's the Bookbinders Consolidated Union. There's the 2 bookbinders joining hands in the union handshake of friendship. The Dove of Peace, bind right with might, which is their marching cry, and their motto at the bottom is united to support but not combined to injure, and combined is a very important word in this story. And there's the harp, and there are the 4 counties, Ulster, Leinster, Munster and Connaught. So you have the whole thing going on there. But the mystery is, why does it say 23rd of June 1788? And the guys at the printing museum didn't know. They didn't know what the banner was for, they didn't know what the date was, and they didn't know what it commemorated. So we told them, and they got super excited. And it commemorates not the strike, but the date of the release from prison of the men who became known as the Martyrs. So, there we are. We start in Dublin. But this story has been largely forgotten, and the question is, why was it forgotten, and how do we know about it at all? And we'll get to that. We know about it largely because of this building, which is on the Balls Pond Road in Islington, about 1.5 miles north of the British Library. It is now called the London Metropolitan Benefit Society's Almshouse, but it was originally called the Bookbinders Asylum, as in retirement home, and it was built in 1843 to provide accommodation for indigent bookbinders. I hope one day I may end up there myself, because heaven knows, we might need it. But it's still there, and it still gives little flats to the poor of the parish. So it's only because of this institution that we know about the Great Strike. But I first read about the strike in the London Bookbinders by Elliot Howe, which is a wonderful book published in 1950. He wrote about the bookbinding trade from 1780 to 1820, and Elliot Howe was a very strange man. He was an orphan who was adopted by very rich people who set him up for life. and he was interested in the occult. You know Aleister Crowley, don't you? Dennis Wheatley, those people. He was a friend of Aleister Crowley's, and he claimed to have been a decipherer during the war. We're not quite sure about that. But Bernard Middleton knew him quite well, and he wrote esoteric books, and then weirdly, he wrote a book about the history of London bookbinders, which is really odd. So we learn about the strike in there rather briefly, but it turns out that every generation has told the story of the strike, rediscovered it. This is from the Book Finishers Friendly Circular, now a very rare publication. There are some in the Bookbinders Museum, 1845 to 51. And in 1845 to 51, some of the veterans from the strike are still alive, so that's important. So this is a brief description of the strike. There's also quite a lot of literature about it in the British Bookbinder, which is a trade journal that existed between 1885 to 92, and they would do a little snippet of the story each month in their publications. You could learn about it in stages. There's also an account in a book called The Story of the National Union of Printing, Bookbinding and Paper Workers, published in 1959, which is really a very dense, complex union history book, which is hard reading, but very important to have on your bookshelf. So really, where does the story begin? Well, I think it begins in 1829. Because in 1829, this group, the Friendly Society of Journeymen Bookbinders of London and Westminster, established the Bookbinders Pension Society. Because there's no national health, and bookbinders don't earn a lot of money, and so that's how it started, as did all the trades. This man is Thomas Dunning, and he wrote in 1860 this article for the Trade Societies and Strikes journal. He was a journalist and bookbinder. And here's a certificate from the Pension Society stating that George Sewell of Carlisle, which is the county town of where we live in Cumbria, has served his time and is now entitled to all the benefits of that society. So that's his certificate. United to support but not combined to injure, etc., etc. Okay? That's in the archive that I'm going to tell you about. This society, the first one of its kind, formed in 1836 an asylum society, like a subcommittee, in order to raise money to build an asylum or rest house in London, and eventually it was built, as I said, in 1843 to provide a home for indigent bookbinders. And that's where this man enters the story. In 1837, John Jaffrey, who was originally from Northumberland, was a working bookbinder in London and a union organiser. So we've got the unions now. And he was dispatched by the union to go round the British Isles raising money to build the asylum. And he took a year to do it, and he did it on foot, this journey. We know about Jaffrey because a lot of people wrote about him, and that's 1837 he did this journey, and this is a description of him from the British Bookmaker in 1890. No man in any trade could have been more earnest to impress his convictions upon his fellows, nor more self-sacrificing and disinterested in the trade's welfare. So what Jaffrey does, as he travels round to build the asylum, and that's what it looked like in the 1860s, he met a lot of old bookbinders in their 70s and 80s who were still working, who remembered the strike from 57 years earlier, and so he was the first person to just write down all the stuff they told him. Never been published before, never been written about before, and had he not done this journey, we probably wouldn't know about it. So, what we learn from Jaffrey's jottings, which are now in a collection in 2 boxes in the British Library called the Jaffrey Collection, we learn that in 1787, 5 journeyman bookbinders were sentenced to 2 years imprisonment in Newgate Jail, the worst prison in London, and their crime was combination, getting together. And I can't remember what year it was, but we can look it up, when the Anti-Combination Acts were passed to stop people from organising. They became known as the Martyrs, or the victims, and they became legends in their trade, and they were celebrated at bookbinding society fundraisers well into the next century. Here's one of their gala dinners from 1839 to benefit the society, and at these dinners, medallions of the Six Martyrs would be worn by the officers of the unions, and their names would be read out and their cause invoked and their great work mentioned and celebrated. And they were, we'll mention them now, they were Thomas Armstrong, William Craig, Thomas Fairburn, Patrick Lilburn and John Wood. So their heroic struggle during a time of great social change and political unrest, of course, sweeping France and America and everywhere else, laid the foundations against all the odds of the first bookbinders trade union in 1836. And in fact, it was the bookbinders who founded the first trade union in England. Everybody thinks it was the printers. It wasn't. As always, the printers think they're first, but they're not. And the reason people think the printers are the first is because the printers have access to the printing press and the bookbinders don't read, so they get their news out. But it was wrong. It was us. It was us. So what does the bookbindery look like in the 18th century? Well, in 1786 there were about 250 bookbinders working in London. 50 were masters who'd served their time and gone on to set up. There were 100 journeymen, ordinary bookbinders, and about 100 others comprised of women and apprentices, and that's how they're described, women and apprentices. In those days they worked from 6 in the morning till 8 at night, 6 days a week. That's an 84-hour week. But there is evidence that in the 1770s they had, through strike action, already gained a reduction of an hour. So if you go back just a few years, they were working from 6 in the morning till 9 at night, which is a 94-hour week, and, 92-hour week, and in busy times they would work later into the night, sometimes till midnight, when bread and beer would be provided. So there's some compensation. The women worked from 9 in the morning till 8 at night. Slackers. So in busy seasons they could work from 5 in the morning till midnight. I wonder how they slept. They earned 15 to 18 shillings a week, which is lower than masons and carpenters and most other artisanal trades earned more than bookbinders. The finishers earned a guinea, so they earned more. The women earned 10 shillings and sixpence. So, there's a bindery from the 18th century, and this is lovely woodcut, we don't know where it's from, but it's in the Jaffrey Collection, and this is what a bindery might have looked like round about then. It's the beginning of the factory, so we've got people ganged up now into mass production. We don't have electricity yet, but we have steam power. We're starting to get machine-operated pressing machines and blockers and guillotines and so on. It's all coming in the next 50 years. But here's a hand bindery with what they look like they're making account books there, and there's a rudimentary guillotine, and there's the standing press, and everything else. And there's the women sitting down to sew and fold. Nothing much has changed. The work was very strongly demarcated. So the women did the folding and the sewing. The forwarders they beat the sections, which was a very demanding job, this 18-pound hammer, and all the binding work, and the finishers did all the gold tooling, the titling and the decoration, and the edge gilding, the polishing, and putting down of end papers. Most masters employed a handful of people, and the work was done chiefly for booksellers, some of whom had their own binderies in the shops. Okay. So that on the union side, in 1779, the first society, or lodge, was formed in London. These were not unions yet, because they weren't allowed, but they were friendly societies. So this first society was called the Society of Friends. They were also called the Dons. Don't really know why. They met at the One Ton pub in the Strand for, quote, a social pint of porter on a Saturday night. So there was the work in the city, and there was the work in the West End, Westminster, two different cities. If you go from Trafalgar Square to St Paul's, it'll take you along the Strand, and that's Westminster, and then it turns into Fleet Street, and that's the city. And the One Ton pub was there, and the Cheshire Cheese was there. And those bookbinders met there, and those bookbinders met there. There's an alleyway between them. The One Ton's gone now, where presumably on a Saturday night they gather in the alleyway and plot the revolution. I'm guessing. This man, John Lovejoy, and weirdly for an 18th century binding, we know that this is a binding by John Lovejoy, because bindings were not signed yet. But this is obviously an important book, and it's a bit odd, isn't it, with all its Masonic symbols and everything. But this is a binding by Lovejoy, a bookbinder in London, and in 1783, he was the one who suggested that work should stop an hour earlier. And the main reason for this was to bring bookbinders into parity with all the other trades. Just a reduction by 1 hour. Dunning, writing in 1760, said this. So, writing in 1960, I beg your pardon, said this. These long hours, when many trades worked from 6 to 6, were felt to be an intolerable grievance and became naturally the subject of conversation at the meetings of the Society of Friends in those two pubs. Lovejoy's proposition caused much discussion throughout the trade, and because of this, pretty soon a second society, the Society of Brothers, was formed. Their nickname was the Dirty Stocking Lodge. Don't know why. It's not recorded. So no progress was made until 1786, when the third society, the City Brothers, also called the Clean Shirt Boys, and we do know why they were called that, because it said on Monday morning few of them had one. They formed a society, and as I say, they weren't unions but friendly societies, established for the purpose of what they called social harmony. Unions came in 1834. So they all put in 1 shilling a week for membership, which is a lot when you're only getting 18 shillings a week. And this was established really for a strike fund. Later, your contribution went towards things like the pensions and so on. But initially, it was a strike fund because they knew the moment was hot because of what was happening around Europe. And so this was the moment they were planning for. The problem was, John Lovejoy, in the intervening 2-3 years, had now become a master and set up in business for himself. And guess what? He now opposed the scheme. That's the way it works. So the discussion continued, and in March 1786, the 3 lodges decided that they needed to take action. They needed people. 4 journeymen volunteered to demand the hour from their employers, and they were told that if it was refused, they would give a week's notice and be supported by the strike fund. Of course, all the masters did refuse the hour. The men gave notice, and Lovejoy, prime mover of the original scheme 3 years before, was one of those masters. And one can only assume that that man was chosen or volunteered because he thought he would have a strong case, because Mr. Lovejoy was the man who started the campaign in the first place. But no, he refused. So the journeymen reacted swiftly, and some, it has to be said, took their guinea from the strike fund and went out to the provinces to seek work. Most bookbinding was in London. There was a lot in Edinburgh, quite a lot in Dublin, and there was bits in Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, but the majority of it, as in printing of course, was in London. So some went off, the rest were enraged, and they called a meeting at the Green Man pub in Bow Street. Pubs are very important because they're often the only meeting places, public meeting places for working people, and they resolved that they were going to strike. 24 of them immediately announced that they were going on strike. Meanwhile, a few of the masters granted the hour, notably John Bell, the bookseller, who becomes part of our story, and the King, George III. He granted the hour to his finisher, who was called John Polwarth. And we've recently been at Windsor teaching. We saw a binding by John Polwarth, which is really quite wonderful. Whether or not the King had gone mad by this stage, I can't remember. What other reason could there be to grant the hour? But perhaps he was rich, and we know that he was a kind and gentle man, so maybe that was why he did it. But most of the booksellers of London and Westminster came down on the side of the masters, of course, because they had this symbiotic relationship. There was a lot published about it, which we can trace. So on the 6th of April, the Morning Chronicle said, It is the determination of the booksellers to give the master bookbinders all the legal support in their power against this unjustifiable confederacy, by procuring for them every indulgence until their journeymen are brought to a proper sense of their duty and interest. Then, 80 more men were dismissed, on top of those 24. This is out of only 250. The masters themselves announced that they were prosecuting them for, quote, unlawfully conspiring, combining, confederating, and agreeing to take from, lessen, and diminish 1 hour in each day from the usual number of hours which they were accustomed to work and labour. These men, by the way, became known as the prosecuting masters. Among them was this chap, James Frazer. Doesn't he look self-satisfied? James Frazer and John Lovejoy, of course, I mentioned. Of Lovejoy, Dunning tells us that his opinion on the subject had now undergone a complete change, but his energy sustained no diminution, as he had been the most active to get the hour reduced, so now he was the most energetic among the employers in resisting. So what they tried to do was to get them in jail before bail was granted. But they had a hero, and his name was Old Nimmo, and he was the bookbinder's spy. That's all we can find out about him. He's called the bookbinder's spy. Don't know who he was. But he obviously had this ability of ingratiating himself with all sorts and getting them on his side. So he got in with the masters and found out the date of their case coming forward. The indictment. So he got notice of the indictment on the 22nd of April, in 2 days' time, and informed the men, who immediately fled London, so they're out of jurisdiction. They met at the gravel pits in Kensington. I don't suppose that's there anymore. And they spent the night at an inn, and Old Nimmo came the next day with the list of the 24 indicted men that he'd got from the masters. So they were all prepared and ready for the fight. They came back to London, went to the court, and were bailed out 6 at a time by several supporters, including John Bell, the bookseller, who had granted the hour, and also John Withers helped him. He was the landlord of the Green Man pub on Bow Street that I mentioned. So the indictment was finally served on the 25th of April, but the bookbinders were very clever in procuring the services of Thomas Erskine, a very well-known barrister, who actually the masters had hoped to get for their case, but they got in first. So of course, as you know, these things drag on because they try and destroy the fight. So the trial was originally set, so this was April when they were indicted. The trial was set for the 3rd of November, 80 men dismissed, and all their families suffering and all that kind of stuff. Set for the 3rd of November, it was then postponed until the 17th of February the following year. And they have to survive now on that strike fund, so it's a very difficult time. As the trial approached, with 80 men and women dismissed, the strike committee of 7 only continued to meet in secret and discuss with Erskine the preparation of their case. So the strike committee published their own statement in the Morning Herald on the 9th of May, and they said this: above 80 men have been discharged from their employment only for countenancing that 13 hours per day were sufficient for a day's work. The employers have forced into the sweet retreats of domestic felicity and deprived their wives from earning a maintenance, because they went too. Most of the women were married to bookbinders. Lives the person that is not forced to acknowledge that such proceedings are a stigma to human nature. So the trial drew near, and Lovejoy, the originator of the scheme, now a master, engendered great bitterness amongst the trade. He had once said to his colleagues that, quote, when he died, they would call him their father and ever revere his memory. But now, of course, they couldn't stand him, especially Hogg, his finisher, who he had dismissed and had arrested. but they were to get their revenge, and this is where old Nimmo comes back into the story. Old Nimmo said to the bookbinders, if you give me a bottle of brandy or rum, I've made this little halter like a noose, and I'll take it and give it to, they delivered it to the masters, right? And it was Lovejoy who got it, and he was, appalled that he got this thing sent to him. So he got this bottle of brandy, and he went over there, and got them all drunk, and picked the halter or the noose out of Lovejoy's pocket, and came it back, and they burned it in a little pan in the pub. So, in the trial, when Lovejoy was telling this story about this noose that he'd been sent, the Erskine said to him, now, Mr. Lovejoy, you've been telling a cock and bull story to injure these honest men. Will you be so kind as to show my Lord Judge and jury the said halter? He put his hand first in one pocket and then in the other, but no halter could be found there. Erskine said, my Lord Judge, is that man proper to appear as a witness at any trial? There was general laughter in the court, and Lovejoy was dismissed in disgrace. So that's pretty weird, isn't it? So straight away, 18 of the 24 men were acquitted, but 6 were not, because they were the first to strike. The others were just, following their lead. And they were, as I said, Armstrong, Craig, Fairburn, Lilburn and Wood, bound over and ordered to go back to work. And it's important to mention that they were all finishers. Why were they all finishers? Because the finishing was the most important and highly prized work in the bindery, and so by withdrawing their labour, they sought to do the most damage. Those are the victims. This is also in the Jaffrey Collection at the British Library. Armstrong, Craig, Lilburn, Ashman, Fairburn, Wood. Hogg isn't on there, and Ashman wasn't one of the victims. So whoever's drawn this has missed out one and added another. But it's beautifully hand-drawn, just on a little piece of paper, and it's there in the archive. In the meantime, the masters, who seem to be having a change of heart, because during this year and a half, one by one, the masters were granting the hour all over London, but the trial was plugged in. They couldn't cancel it. But the masters urged their counsel not to press for conviction, because they were sick of the whole affair, and they were being brought down by the strike. And so they were willing to grant the hour. The strike kind of had won. But the trial went on. The strike committee continued, dissolved officially, continued to meet in secret. 3 of the hostages remained on strike. They were Armstrong, Lilburn and Craig. Fairburn went back to Bell, who had already granted the hour in the intervening time, and Hogg returned to Lovejoy because he had been dismissed in disgrace in the witness box. Wood was the only one who set up for himself. He'd inherited a bit of money, and he provided work for some of the other journeymen who had been dismissed. So they were trying, obviously, to do their best to carry on going. So after all that, because they can't cancel the thing, even though everybody wants it over, they had to have a second trial, and that was set for the 8th of May. The 6 ringleaders made affidavits, probably against their will, to relinquish their claim to the hour, and they urged all the rest to do the same. But of course the others would not give up an hour that most of them had already won. So, in the end, the accused finishers said they were prepared to face jail in order to keep the hour for the others. This is why they're called the victims or the martyrs. On May the 8th, they appeared at Westminster Hall. The hearing lasted half an hour, and they were sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. Now, Newgate Jail was a notoriously bad jail, one of the 7 jails in the circumference of inner London. Slight typographical amusement here. You know, when you're doing that backwards, you can't always remember. But there's Newgate Prison from about 1820. And interestingly, there were obviously different grades of prisoner. You had to provide for yourself, just like you did in the workhouse, where Dickens's father lived. And so the only way you could survive if you had friends on the outside who would bring you sustenance. They weren't locked up with common criminals, in other words, but they shared quite a nice room of their own with a lovely fire. And Robert Pratt, who was a bookbinder at the time, kept a little diary, and this is what he said. They were well supplied with presents. They were daily visited in Newgate by binders and others. The liquor drank on such occasions would come to no small amount. Jaffrey also mentions legs of mutton, ribs of beef, gallons of beer, bottles of gin, and friendly balls. Each in turn assisted them to cheer them in their captivity. And in fact, it seems, when it comes to gallons of beer, I read somewhere else, they actually brought in whole barrels and had a tap house going, William Wood died in prison. He succumbed. It is said if he had lushed like the others, he would not have died. But actually, he died of jail fever, which is distemper, in March of 1788. And he had a dramatic funeral, which William Hall described to Jaffrey. This is a man he met in Northumberland when he was in his 80s. So there was a very large concourse of people attending his funeral, which came down Newgate, along Fleet Street, coming opposite Mr. Matthews' house. That was his employer. Mrs. Matthews, Wood's aunt, so his employer, who did not grant the hour, was his uncle. Mrs. Matthews, Wood's aunt, was standing looking through their dining room window. The corpse was lowered to the flags with a heavy groan. Mrs. Matthews was observed to fall down. It was supposed that she fainted at the sight, as they were somehow, it says here, the cause of his imprisonment. So the 4 remaining men in jail were there for almost a year when the sheriff of those parts, Sir Matthew Bloxham, came to visit. He saw in this room 4 well-dressed, clean men with a joint roasting at the fire, and he said, "What men are these? These can never be felons." The keeper said, "Oh, sir, these are the bookbinders in for combination." And Bloxham said, "What? The bookbinders here still? I thought they had been liberated long since. By your appearance you must have many friends out of doors. Get a petition made out and bring it to me. You shall not much be longer here. I am a bookbinder myself." And actually he wasn't a bookbinder, he was a stationer. So he was boasting a little bit. In fact, he was a partner in a company called Bloxham and Fordrinia. Yes, he was a partner with the Fordrinia brothers who invented the first paper-making machine. Rather interesting. 3 weeks later, they were still there. He came on his little tour again, and he said, "What? Have you heard nothing of that petition yet? Keeper, call a hackney coach for me." So he went to the Secretary of State's office and found the petition buried under a large pile of papers, sent it off to the king with a few lines of his own added, and they were released the next day, on June the 28th, 1788, the day mentioned on the banner, the day that we celebrate. The day after the release, the 4 martyrs rode around the town in coaches, rather like that parade that happened yesterday in Oakland to celebrate some kind of other success. Can't quite remember what it was. 1.5 million people turned out to greet them in London. I don't know, maybe a few thousand. But they visited all their colleagues and they received presents and money and all that kind of stuff. They were all given, I think, £100 each so they could go into business by themselves, which they did. Armstrong and Fairburn set up together, and again, weirdly for the time, this is a binding by Armstrong and Fairburn. Rather nice. I don't know where that binding is. Somebody just tracked down that photograph for me. And Craig also set up for himself, but Lilburn, the only thing that's known about him is that he is recorded as moving into the country. So that could mean one of many things. But the anniversary dinners continued well into the 1950s. This is from the archive. All of these are dinner tickets, for the annual gala. They are they're held on June the 28th every year, well into the 1950s, this particular collection, and it was revived after the First World War and continued to have, I don't think quite such formal events, but there continued to be little gatherings in London from about 1920 up to about 1948, which is why one of my teachers remembers going to one of these things. That's sort of where we got to, but there was another strike in 1805 called the Tea Half-Hour Strike. And this was a very acrimonious affair. There was felt there was no point in having another strike because many employers, again, already granted the tea half-hour. So it was sort of, they went to strike a bit and then it was averted and the half-hour was granted. Of course, it's important to stress this wasn't a break for a cup of tea. This was a tea half-hour at about 5 o'clock, and it was for an evening meal. That's what we mean by tea. And Dunning noted that much more work was done in a given time after tea through the refreshing power of that meal than in the same number of hours before. Why are we not surprised to hear that, you know? So officially the strike failed, but over the course of the next 3 years, the half-hour was granted universally throughout the trade. There's a rare thing. That's an anniversary dinner to celebrate the tea half-hour strike. The Jubilee Supper from 1856.
Where was that from?
That's also in the Jaffrey Collection. So I think this is a one-off dinner to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the success of the tea half-hour movement. So in conclusion, the extraordinary events of the Great Strike of 1786 were felt well into the next century and gave bookbinders the resolve to fight for the establishment of the first trade union. The unjust laws against combination were repealed in 1825, and in 1834 the London Consolidated Lodge of Journeymen Bookbinders was established and is believed to be the first official trade union in England. Over the next 100 years, many more demands for shorter working weeks and better pay were sought and earned, which resulted in a reduction to 54 hours in 1880 and a further reduction of 50 hours in 1914. And finally, and it's not really finally, in 1936, the 43.5-hour week was won, 156 years after a few brave bookbinders with limited resources and the full force of the law against them dared to stand up and demand the smallest improvement in their working lives. So I would like to invite you to be proud of our craft and the part it played in establishing better working conditions and shorter hours for those who labour under its demands, and for our pioneering work of the union movement, and not least for laying the groundwork for the 40-hour week. And as it says on the banner, united to support, not combined to injure, and let us bind right with might. Thank you very much.